It all started with a late-night conversation with my friend Josh over coffee at our favorite diner. Josh and I had known each other since college, and though he always had a bit of a thrill-seeking side, nothing had ever suggested that he'd venture into the dark web, let alone make a life-changing decision based on what he found there. "There's a house," he said, lowering his voice to a conspiratorial whisper. "I bought it for almost nothing." I raised an eyebrow, eyeing him skeptically. "A house for almost nothing? Where'd you find a deal like that?" He hesitated, glancing around the nearly empty diner before leaning in. I found it on the dark web." The words hung in the air between us like a chill. "You're telling me you found a house on the dark web and you just went for it?" I stammered, unable to hide my disbelief. Josh shrugged, though his eyes sparkled with a mixture of excitement and unease. "I know it sounds insane, but it was just too good to pass up. The listing didn't have any details about previous owners, just vague hints about its unique character and long history. They were practically giving it away, and I figured why not?" Despite my attempts to dissuade him, Josh was resolute. Within a week, he was the proud owner of a dilapidated, century-old Victorian-style house in a rural area miles from the nearest town. At first, I could tell he was enamored by the idea of owning something so mysterious. But as the weeks went by, things started to change. The move-in. I joined Josh on the move-in day. We drove through desolate country roads, fields stretching into the horizon, and after what seemed like an eternity, we arrived. The house stood ominously at the end of a dirt driveway, cloaked in shadows from the towering trees that surrounded it. Its Gothic turrets and peeling paint gave it an almost menacing appearance, and I couldn't shake the feeling that the house was watching us. As we stepped inside, the musty scent of damp wood and stale air filled our lungs. Dust motes danced in the dim light that filtered through the grimy windows. Cobwebs hung in thick strands from the corners, and the silence was so complete it felt like the house was holding its breath. "Some fixer-upper you got here," I muttered, half joking as I set a box down on the creaky floor. Josh laughed, though it sounded forced. "Yeah, it has charm." Despite the house's state, he seemed determined to make it work. We spent the day unpacking and cleaning, but as dusk settled, an unsettling feeling began to creep over me. There was something wrong with the place. An intangible heaviness lingered in every room. I mentioned it to Josh, but he brushed it off, insisting that it was just the house settling after years of vacancy. The first night. I decided to stay the night, mostly to keep Josh company as he settled into his new home. But as the evening wore on, strange things began to happen. It started with a low, rhythmic thumping sound that seemed to come from beneath the floor. I asked Josh if he'd heard it, but he just shrugged, attributing it to the old pipes. Yet, as the hours ticked by, the sound grew louder, more insistent, almost as if it was trying to communicate with us. Around midnight, I was jolted awake by what I thought was someone whispering. I sat up in the dusty old bed Josh had provided, straining my ears in the dark. There was no one there, just silence. But the sense of being watched was overwhelming, and my skin prickled with unease. Unable to shake the feeling, I made my way downstairs to the living room, where I found Josh staring at a locked door at the end of a narrow hallway. His expression was a mixture of curiosity and dread. "What's behind there?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. He shook his head slowly. "I don't know. It wasn't on the floor plan. I didn't even notice it until now." We both stood there, staring at the door, an unspoken understanding passing between us. We knew without saying it that this door was different from the rest. There was an air of secrecy, a foreboding presence that seemed to radiate from behind it. Josh fumbled with the key ring the former owners had left him, selecting one old rusty key that looked like it might fit. With a shaky hand, he inserted it into the lock and turned. The door creaked open, revealing a dark staircase descending into a black void. A cold draft hit us as we peered down into the darkness, the smell of damp earth and something else, something metallic and sickly sweet, wafting up from below. Maybe we should check it out tomorrow, I suggested, my voice quivering. But Josh, ever the thrill-seeker, shook his head. Come on, it's just a basement. What's the worst that could happen? Reluctantly, I followed him down the stairs, each step creaking ominously beneath our weight. The darkness was suffocating, and the beam of Josh's flashlight barely cut through the thick, stale air.
The deeper we descended, the stronger the sickly sweet smell became, until it was almost overpowering. At the bottom of the stairs, we found ourselves in a small, cramped space. The walls were rough stone, slick with moisture, and the floor was covered in a thin layer of grime. Old rusted metal hooks hung from the ceiling, and the walls were lined with shelves stacked with decaying cardboard boxes and glass jars filled with unidentifiable substances. What is this place? I whispered, more to myself than to Josh. He shrugged, looking around with morbid fascination. Maybe it's just an old storage room? But as we moved further into the basement, something caught my eye, a faint glint in the darkness. I pointed it out to Josh, who shone his flashlight on it, revealing a small brass key lying on the ground. What do you think it's for? He asked, picking it up. I shook my head. I don't know, but I don't like this place. We turned to leave, but as we ascended the stairs, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching us. When I glanced back, my heart froze. In the dim light, I thought I saw a shadow shifting in the darkness, a shape standing just beyond the reach of the flashlight's beam. Let's go, I muttered, gripping Josh's arm as we hurried up the stairs. He didn't protest. Once we were back upstairs, I closed the basement door firmly behind us, breathing a sigh of relief. But that relief was short-lived. I couldn't shake the image of that shadow, lurking in the darkness below, watching us with unseen eyes. The journal. The next morning, we returned to the basement. This time, we were better prepared, armed with flashlights, gloves, and a determination to figure out what exactly Josh had gotten himself into. As we sifted through the boxes, we found various oddities, dusty trinkets, strange symbols carved into pieces of wood, and a collection of old photographs of people who looked like they were from another era. But the most disturbing find was a worn, leather-bound journal, its pages yellowed and brittle with age. The handwriting was cramped and barely legible, as though the writer had been in a hurry or suffering from some kind of mania. The entries were erratic, filled with ramblings about the darkness and the Watchers. One entry caught my attention. I thought I could contain it, but it's stronger than I anticipated. Every night it grows louder, clawing at the walls, begging to be free. I can't let it out. I can't. The final entries became even more frantic, the handwriting deteriorating into near illegibility. But the last line sent a chill down my spine. If you're reading this, it's already too late. Leave this place. Do not go back into the basement. When I showed the entry to Josh, his face paled, but he forced a smile. It's just someone's deranged ramblings, maybe a former owner with a wild imagination. I wanted to believe him. I really did. But that night, as we lay in the darkness, the rhythmic thumping started again, louder this time, as if something was trying to claw its way through the walls. My friend Mike had always been fascinated by the unusual. He liked to brag that he'd seen it all, claiming that the world couldn't surprise him anymore. So when he came across a house listing on the dark web for a massive century-old Victorian mansion in an isolated town at an incredibly low price, he couldn't resist. The house was oddly beautiful in its own way, with tall Gothic arches and intricate carvings decorating the doors and windows. But there was something about it that felt cold, and the longer you looked, the more you could feel an unplaceable sense of unease. Mike had called me over to check it out a few weeks after moving in, And though I'd initially laughed at the dark web mansion idea, I was curious. He seemed eager to show off, and I noticed a glimmer of pride mixed with an edge of uncertainty in his eyes. Settling in. Day 1. The first day I stayed over, everything seemed almost normal. Mike gave me a tour, highlighting the oddities he had found. Creaking floorboards, strange wiring that didn't seem connected to anything, and a large number of old heavy doors that appeared to lead nowhere. One of these doors in particular caught my attention. It was located at the end of a long, dimly lit hallway. The frame was carved with symbols that didn't seem to belong to any language I knew, and the door was sealed tight, as though glued in place. Despite his curiosity, Mike said he hadn't been able to open it, and eventually, he'd decided to leave it alone. "Whatever's in there can stay there," he said with a shrug. But I noticed his gaze lingered on it for a few seconds longer than necessary. As night fell, a quiet unease seemed to settle over the house, a change that I could feel in my bones. I chalked it up to the age of the place, thinking it was just my mind playing tricks on me. Mike and I settled into the living room to watch a movie, and soon I found myself drifting off on the couch. The first night, shadows and whispers. I awoke sometime around 3 a.m., my eyes snapping open to absolute silence. It took me a moment to remember where I was, and then I noticed something strange. The house felt different. The air was colder, heavy with an unfamiliar metallic smell. The shadows around the room seemed denser, darker, as if they were swallowing up any trace of light. As I sat up, I realized that the room wasn't the same as I'd remembered. The furniture was rearranged, and there was an additional door on the far side of the room that hadn't been there before. My heart started pounding as I stared at it, trying to convince myself that I was just groggy, that I was imagining things. But the door was there, solid and looming, with a faint scratching sound coming from the other side. I glanced over at Mike, who was sleeping soundly on the couch. Deciding not to wake him, I crept toward the door, my heart racing. The scratching grew louder as I approached, but just as I reached for the handle, the sound stopped. I held my breath waiting, my hand hovering inches from the knob. Then, just as I touched the door, a loud, sudden thud from the other side made me jump back. I froze, paralyzed with fear, and watched as the door slowly faded away, dissolving into the wall as though it had never been there. I backed away, feeling a chill creep up my spine. Something was wrong with this house. Night 2. The new room. I tried to bring it up with Mike the next morning, but he laughed it off, dismissing it as a nightmare. He didn't seem to notice anything strange, so I convinced myself that maybe he was right. But that night I woke up again at the same time, 3 a.m. This time the entire layout of the living room had changed. The furniture was different, and in place of the windows there were several small, square openings that looked like they belonged in a dungeon rather than a living room. Through one of these openings I could see a narrow, dark corridor lined with ancient-looking wallpaper, a corridor that I was sure hadn't been there before. As I stared, a figure appeared at the far end of the corridor. It was a woman in a long, tattered dress, her face hidden in shadow. She stood there, motionless, her head tilted as if she were watching me. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe as I watched her take a single, deliberate step toward me. Then, just as suddenly as she'd appeared, the corridor vanished, replaced by the familiar walls of the living room. I stumbled back, gasping, and shook Mike awake, trying to explain what I'd seen. But he looked at me with concern, telling me that I needed sleep and that I was probably just seeing things. Night 3. The hidden staircase. The third night, I couldn't sleep at all. I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, waiting for whatever horrors the night would bring. At exactly 3 a.m., I heard a soft, distant creaking like a door slowly opening. This time, I wasn't alone. Mike was awake too, his eyes wide with fear as he stared at the spot where the door had appeared the previous night. But this time, instead of a door, there was a staircase leading downward, spiraling into darkness. We looked at each other, wordless, and Mike swallowed hard, his face pale. "I didn't believe you," he whispered. "I thought you were just tired." Without thinking, we both stood up and moved toward the staircase, drawn by an inexplicable force. The air was thick, oppressive, and I felt as though something was watching us from the shadows. As we descended, the walls closed in, and the staircase seemed to stretch endlessly downward. The deeper we went, the more distorted the walls became, shifting and pulsing as though they were alive. Finally, we reached a small, dimly lit room. In the center was an altar covered in strange symbols, and on it lay an old leather-bound book. The walls were covered in photographs of people with hollow, haunting eyes. Some of them looked eerily familiar, and I felt a sickening realization creeping over me. One of the faces, it looked like Mike. He stepped forward, reaching out to touch the photograph, but as he did, the lights flickered, and the shadows around us began to move. Figures emerged from the walls, their faces twisted with agony, their eyes staring straight through us. We turned and ran, scrambling back up the stairs, but the staircase seemed to stretch on forever, and the shadowy figures followed us, their voices whispering in languages I couldn't understand. The escape. Uncovering the truth. When we finally burst through the door and back into the living room, it was morning. The sun was shining and everything looked exactly as it had the day before, but I knew that it wasn't over. Mike's face was pale, his hands shaking as he locked the doors and windows, as though that could keep whatever horrors we'd seen at bay. Over the next few days, we tried to research the house, looking for any information that could explain what we had seen. Finally, we stumbled upon a reference to an old cult that had used the house in the late 1800s for rituals meant to bind lost souls, using the structure itself as a vessel to trap them. Realizing the truth, Mike decided to leave the house, abandoning it as fast as he could. He never went back, but he told me that sometimes in the middle of the night, he still hears that faint scratching at his door, and he knows deep down that the house isn't done with him yet.